everyone, Alexa Dunn here, and happy 2018. It's a new year and I'm looking forward to a whole year of tons more awesome content, and I'm gonna kick it off with a Q&A. I want to thank all of you for submitting some awesome questions. I put the call out a few weeks ago and I will link down below to that post, or you can also drop more questions down below on this post. I'm definitely going to be doing more Q&As in the future. It's a much easier way to directly engage with some of your specific questions instead of just down below in the comments, putting them into video so that everyone can kind of watch them and get the answers. Some of these are fantastic specific questions for me about my writing process or about Brightly Burning, my debut novel, which comes out on May 1st, and a lot of them are fantastically broad, general writing and industry questions that will help a wide swath of people. So I'm going to tackle as many of these as I can, but some of them are going to prompt some really in-depth answers, and so I'm most likely going to be breaking this up into more than one Q&A video. So consider this Q&A video number 1, January edition, January 2018 edition, and I will definitely be doing a part 2 later. So again, drop any questions that you come up with. If you missed the first call for questions, you can drop any of them down below or on the original video and I will add them to the list. First, I'm going to start with 2 great questions from Angelica Pickles. Love the username. The first one is, I am a huge procrastinator, and even though I've evolved my book in my head for over 2 years now, I don't have the confidence to just sit down and write it. I feel like I'm afraid of it not turning out as good as I think it is in my head. Did you have that kind of doubt before you write Brightly Burning, and what was it that made you finally sit down and write it? I 100% relate. I definitely had that doubt about Brightly Burning, and specifically about Brightly Burning, more than any other book that I tried to write, because in my head, Jane Eyre in Space was going to be my magnum opus novel. I was like, oh, this is the best idea I've ever had. I don't think I'm ever going to have such a great pitchable idea, but I want this to be a really beautiful book. This is going to be my literary YA novel because Jane Eyre is such a beautiful book and it's beautifully written, and I cannot hold a candle to Charlotte Bronte. I still can't, never will. So in my head, I had hyped it up as this big book, and in my mind, you know, I would write some of the more commercial genre books that I love writing, I'm still writing, and then this one would be like my 3rd or 4th book, and it would show the world what a beautiful writer I was. And I just wasn't that writer when it actually came time to sit down and write it, when I wanted to write it. And for a while that held me back. It held me back for a couple years actually, where I said, nope, that's a back burner project. And what finally made me just do it, honestly, is I had nothing else left. I had shelved, my first book was shelved after we went on submission. It didn't work out. And my second book, which I thought was gonna be like my big debut book, it's still a book that I love, but it washed out in querying. It did really badly. And I was like, what am I gonna work on next? I felt like I didn't have any passion for any of my other ideas. I have a lot of ideas, but Jane Eyre in Space kept kind of niggling in my brain, and I was like, but you're not good enough to write it. And then honestly, I just got really mad. I got really frustrated at the industry and at myself, and I was feeling sorry for myself. And so honestly, what kicked me in the pants to just do it was I said, profanity warning, I said, fuck it. I said, fuck it. I love this idea. I want to write it. I am not the writer that I think I need to be to write it, but who cares? I'm going to write this book the way that I am capable of writing it right now in this very moment. And I just started writing and I didn't look back, and I have 0 regrets. I think everything happens for a reason, and I think that we often procrastinate on books for a reason, and we also kick ourselves in the pants on books for the right reason at the right time. It's all murky happenstance, and I kicked myself in the pants at just the right moment. I wrote the book, and because I wrote the book that I wanted to write and was capable of writing in the moment, Brightly Burning is not a literary YA magnum opus, and I don't know if I'm ever going to be that writer, and that is okay. So writing this novel, what it really taught me about myself was that I didn't, I shouldn't hold myself to such lofty expectations. So often procrastination, because that is the root of your question, is rooted in self-doubt. It is rooted in perfectionism. It's rooted in the vision that we have of ourselves as authors, as novelists. And so often it is, we're holding ourselves up to standards of others. Because I was thinking of beautiful literary novels that I admired as a reader, not even YA, but one of my favorite books, for example, is Never Let Me Go. And that book is so gorgeous. And I dreamed in my heart of writing something as beautiful as that. And I think that sometimes those aspirations hold us back. So it was all meant to be, because I love Brightly Burning for what it is. And it is a proper YA novel. It is fast-paced and it is commercial and it's full of teen feelings, and I am not Charlotte Bronte, and it is not a beautiful literary book, but dagnabbit, I like it. So basically how I fixed the procrastination, so to speak, is I got mad. I got frustrated. I wanted to work on a book. I needed to work on a project. I needed to have a project I could, you know, attach all my hopes to when querying, well, when my first agent relationship didn't work out and when querying didn't work out, I needed something to focus on that I loved. And so I just threw caution to the wind and I did it. And so that's my advice to you. If you feel like you're procrastinating and you're stuck in pre-writing, you either need to, again, profanity warning, you need to shit or get off the pot. That is my advice. If you're gonna write the book, write it now, do it. But if you also genuinely feel like you are just not in the right headspace to write the book, find another project and write something else. Because I will say, writing my second book in the 2 years where I let Jane Eyre and Space incubate, I do think helped me as a writer and helped me bring Brightly Burning to fruition in a publishable format. So sometimes your procrastination is sending you a message, and sometimes you gotta, you know, yell at the flicker of self-doubt within you and just freaking write the book. Angelica's second question, which I just really liked, it's a great one, is, as Brightly Burning is sci-fi, I was wondering if you had any kind of specialist knowledge in that genre or in science in general. I want to incorporate sci-fi into my series, but I am a layman scientifically, so I was wondering if you think an author particularly needs to be well educated in scientific subjects before they should embark upon writing sci-fi. I love this question. This is a fantastic question, and I think I'm the perfect person to answer it for sci-fi layman, because I am a sci-fi layman. Now, I do think that to achieve certain levels of science fiction, you do need to have a higher expertise level in science, or at least really good research skills. However, I consider Brightly Burning light sci-fi. I consider it sci-fi for people who don't like sci-fi or don't think they like sci-fi, but we'll find out that sci-fi can be many things, and that sci-fi can be very accessible to laymen. And I actually think that often when you're trying to reach readers who feel intimidated by sci-fi and by science, it is best for someone who is also kind of a layman in sci-fi to write those stories. There's a place for hard sci-fi written by legit science people, and there is a place for light sci-fi written by people who are also approaching it from a more mainstream point of view. So to give you kind of my background, I don't have a background in science really at all. I majored in journalism in college. I minored in German. I always liked biology. I liked my biology class, and in college I enjoyed environmental science greatly, but I never really liked chemistry or physics. I actually never took physics in high school through a weird loophole with my exchange program experience, so I'm super layman. I also didn't come to sci-fi in terms of pop culture until I was a lot older. I didn't grow up in a household with a heavy sci-fi fantasy influence, so I saw Star Wars as a teenager for the first time. I believe I was 13 because the original trilogy, not the alpha prequels, were re-released in the mid-90s ahead of the prequels. I have never seen an episode of Star Trek. I've seen the movies, the new movies. I'm revealing all my darkest secrets here. But I fell head over heels in love with Battlestar Galactica, the reboot, when it was on television. And it remains one of my all-time favorite series. I have watched it start to finish at least 4 times, and at the same time I also fell in love with Doctor Who. So I kind of had this sci-fi renaissance when I was in college, and I devoured lots and lots of sci-fi. And of course I realized in hindsight that a lot of the things I liked when I was younger were actually sci-fi, and they were accessible, light sci-fi. Like my favorite movie when I was 12, whenever it came out, was Gattaca. I still love Gattaca. It's a great freaking movie. So that is how I come to it. And so how I approach it is I use conventions that I have absorbed from the sci-fi media that I enjoy. I did light research, and then I employed what I call science betas. I employed critique partners, not literally employed, I didn't pay them, they were reciprocal critique partners, people that I know who are really, really smart, who know science really, really well. And I basically had them do a science beta on my book just to let me know if I had really messed anything up. And the good news is, for the most part, from absorbing sci-fi from television, movies, and various books that I had read and kind of based things that I knew, like there's no sound in space, so you can't have screaming in space and all that kind of fun stuff, I did okay. So I had my science betas, including one who was literally a rocket scientist, basically proof my stuff. There's still probably some science errors. It's a little hand-wavy because at the end of the day it is fiction, but that is my advice to you, a fellow layman in sci-fi. If you love sci-fi, you go ahead and write sci-fi. Approach it as a light sci-fi, you know, always think about the logic of how you're approaching science, do research as needed, and get qualified critique partners. Now a question from Cameron, who sent this to me via Instagram. Cameron asks, from the time you got your agent to now, how much did your manuscript for Brightly Burning change? As in, how much did your editor/agent revise? Does it look like a completely different book? Or was your experience with editing just a matter of grammar corrections? Was there a big jump in word count? Great question. So let's start with pre-agent. So I actually did the thing that you should not do. Don't do this, because admittedly I draft pretty cleanly. So I wrote what I call draft 0 of Brightly Burning. It was done in early February of 2016. I did a very fast revision on it. I did a draft 0 revision, deleting some characters and doing cleanup, and I revised it in about 10 days, and I queried it at the end of February. Do not do as I do, do as I say. So meaning the version that got my literary agent was essentially what I would call a solid draft 1. So I did 2 big things in my revision with my agent before we went on submission with Brightly Burning. I'll be careful about how I talk about this stuff so that there aren't massive spoilers, but the first big thing that I did was what I call a language and tone cleanup. So when I wrote the first draft, I kind of oscillated between modern YA speak, so to speak, and kind of more Jane Eyre, Jane Austen-y type language. And so in my first pass, I had to make a choice, and I uniformly went for more of a modern commercial YA tone and language, which meant cleaning up a lot of dialogue and changing things, but also for a few key characters just disclaiming that, oh, they speak more formally because of XYZ, because there were certain things I wanted to still have kind of a vague flavor of a more kind of Jane Eyre type prose. So that was one thing. The second thing is, so because I'm a pantser, while I draft clean, sometimes things do come out of the blue when, you know, later in the writing process when I have a brainwave. So about 50% of my way into my draft of Brightly Burning, I came up with a central mystery because I had to solve a third act problem with Jane Eyre. Long story short, I came up with a central mystery that is now kind of the overarching mystery plot of the book, not the one that is from Jane Eyre. I introduced something completely separate to just kind of keep readers on their toes a bit. And so the big revision I did with my agent before we went on submission is I had to weave that through the entire story. So that meant I scrapped a character, or I gave a character plastic surgery or facelift, so to speak. I had one red herring character. I changed who that red herring character was to this new character. I gave this new character a completely different backstory, a different function in the story, and had to weave in this character in a bunch of scenes earlier on in the book and add a couple structural devices, which I won't spoil, to basically make it so you didn't get to the 50% of the book and go, well, where the heck did that come from? So it was kind of, it was like taking a thread and weaving it better through the manuscript. So I wouldn't say major, massive changes, but structurally it like sucked everything kind of together a lot better. Then after my first round of submission, I've talked about this before in other videos, I didn't sell my book. And I did another revision, and this one I would say was a much bigger revision. So I did a pacing revision on the first 70 pages of the book. So I cut about 6,000 words out of 18,000 words. So I cut a third of the words that were in the first half of the book, first third of the book, just to make it a much tighter read. Then I looked at the middle and I did beefing up. I actually added a lot to the middle of the book because it needed more romantic tension, conflict, and pacing in the romance. The romance needed to be more of a page turner, so I beefed that up. And then I made pretty major / minor changes to the third act. The soul of the third act never changed, but I added a lot more higher stakes, and I threw out, I want to say, 2 chapters that had been transition chapters. I rewrote them, approached them in a new way, and kind of gave the third act a different backbone. It involved character death. There were some big changes to the third act. So that was my most major edit pass on the book. Like the most things like structure, skeleton, structural things changed in that revision. And so then when I sold it, I actually did pretty light edits with my editor. My editor liked those changes that I had made in that revision and what it did for the book, and we worked on refining those changes that I had made. In my middle, I rewrote the first major scene of romantic tension between Stella and Hugo to kind of make their romance a bit more of a slow build, and I made further tweaks to the third act to make the changes I had made in the last pass work. So essentially I both did and didn't make major changes, and those major changes did happen before I sold the book. Sometimes it happens the other way. You sell your book on submission, and then your editor is the one that makes those big, tightening structural changes with you, but I just happened to make them between editorial rounds before I sold my book. And I just want to disclaim, just to you authors out there who are new to the process, that generally speaking, you never are going to get away with just tightening grammar or copy editing when it comes to your editor at your publishing house. You're always going to have to do some kind of content and developmental edits once you sell your book. And so I did work on those with my editor, just it was fine-tuning the developmental edits I had done right before she bought my book. A great question from Alexander Speece, and that is, what makes novels seem like first novels? This is because I have mentioned this in a couple of videos, and I'm going to cheat a little, and I'm going to link you down below to both of my common mistakes that newbie writers make videos, because a lot of those mistakes working together in concert definitely contribute to the feeling of a first novel. But overall, it's often just a lack of sophistication in the prose, in some of the storytelling choices, and some of the conflict and stakes choices, as well as specific execution in scenes. Something I can definitely point to that I definitely did in my first novel, and in some of the subsequent ones, this is just kind of a newer writer mistake, is just really needless melodrama in scenes, especially dramatic scenes. Like learning how to properly build dramatic tension and then have it come to a head in a big scene, that takes practice. And in a lot of first novels, the buildup is missing, or it's there and it lasts too long. And then in big scenes, it's just really way over the top. Really ridiculous, unrealistic, didactic dialogue, big dramatic internal thoughts that just feel a bit too cheesy. That's definitely something that I've done, and that's something that I see in a lot of first novels. And also just generally, a lot of first novels, they read like fan fiction in the sense that there's a tendency with fanfic writers to navel gaze a lot. There's a lot of, it's you're kind of processing the story and the characters for yourself. So you write a lot of filler. You write a lot of scenes where it's just like dialogue being volleyed back and forth, or characters discovering their surroundings or thinking a lot of different things. So a lot of first novels suffer from this, where they just drag. And so it's a pacing issue. I also see just kind of a lack of variation in sentence structure. So that's back to the unsophisticated prose, where the sentences are just kind of boring, they're not very interesting, or on the flip end, they're way too purple where a writer is trying too hard. There's just kind of a sophistication in more polished novels or later novels of how to move a story along and balance kind of readable prose with making sure that stuff is happening. The good news is you can work on a lot of these first novel problems in revision. Some first novels are definitely salvageable and you can revise them up to a submittable quality, but sometimes honestly you just have to work on another book. It's kind of a case-by-case basis depending on the writer and the story. A question from Lindsay Puckett. She wants to know about the process of finding, hiring, working with a freelance editor before querying. And I'm gonna throw a little wrench in the works here. I do not recommend that you hire a freelance editor before you query, because if you're querying, that means you are pursuing traditional publishing. And if you're pursuing traditional publishing, you should not hire an editor. The whole point of traditional publishing is money will always flow to the author, and you get the publishing deal that you get and the payment arrangement that you get and the structure that you get in exchange for a team of professionals working with you to edit your novel. The whole point is not paying someone. And I'd say that if an author is going to be traditionally published, part of the preparation process of being an author who can function in the traditional publishing world is learning to self-edit and develop constructive relationships with critique partners so that you can self-edit before you get to the agent and the editor stage. So my advice is honestly to develop critique partner relationships. This is the norm for people who are being traditionally published. They don't hire freelance editors. They learn to self-edit working with fellow writers as critique partners. And then once they get to their agent and their publishing house, they work with professionals who work with them for free, because money flows to the author, to work on the books. Now, some people will of course still choose to hire a freelance editor, even if they are pursuing traditional publishing. And I'll say that if you are indie publishing, you should always hire freelance editors to work with you on your work, because you don't have the traditional publishing infrastructure to do that for you. So you should always hire if you're going indie. But if you still really want to hire a professional editor before querying, again, I don't recommend it. I'm gonna be posting a video in the next week all about critique partners. It's a little series of what critique partners are and how to find them and how to work with them. And so hopefully that will help you with that. But if you do decide to hire one, I encourage you strongly to do your research and look at qualifications. The thing with freelance editing is it's a lot like agenting. Anyone can hang a shingle on the internet and call themselves an editor, but most people are not actually qualified to be an editor. I will say this delicately. I have found that in a lot of cases, individuals who put themselves out there as professional editors for novelists, for books, are offering nothing better than you can get from a qualified and free critique partner. Very often these individuals, in fact, are critique partners, good critique partners, and they think, oh, I'm good at this, I can charge for this. And that is a decision totally up to them. They can make it. But I think that it just goes to show that you can find a free critique partner to do as good or better than someone who is charging to be an editor. So you need to look at qualifications. Have they just done it as a hobby and they think they're good at it and they've decided to charge, or do they have qualifications? Have they worked at a publisher? Have they worked at a reputable agency? Have they taken an editing course and gotten a certificate? That is a thing. Have they worked in an adjacent field such as copy editing or journalism, and they have years and years of professional experience? Though, of course, in those cases, you would be mostly hiring them as copy editors, and I really don't think you need a copy editor before you query. If you're gonna hire any kind of editor before you query, it would probably be a developmental editor, but then I don't think that is a worthwhile investment about 90% of the time. So just bear that in mind. I advise critique partners, and if you're not gonna go that route, do your research and make sure the person is qualified to be offering their services as an editor. And last but not least, in part 1 of the Q&A, because I am rambling on and these answers are very, very long, this one will hopefully be a bit shorter, and then I'm gonna cover the rest of the questions in part 2. And that is a fun question from Armstrong Hawkins. What are 3 books that you read in school that you thought were fantastic? Middle school, high school, or college. 3 books at any point in your schooling that were assigned to read, and after reading you thought the book was fantastic. So my first one is Tess of the D'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy. I adore this book, though it is hella depressing. I read it in 12th grade in AP English, and then Thomas Hardy actually ended up being on the AP exam with one of his poems, so that was kind of cool. But I love Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Thomas Hardy, and just the way that he writes about nature is just gorgeous. And then the book frustrated me on every level because it's supposed to. It's about all these horrible things that happen to this woman who does not deserve them, and all the ways in which her society is oppressive and misogynist, and this book is just very, very ahead of its times. It's devastating. It does not have a happy ending, but I adore it. Next is Into Thin Air by Jon Krakauer. So I read this in college for, I believe it was my philosophy class. It's funny, I was a journalism major, but I read Into Thin Air for philosophy and not for a journalism course, I think. It's all kind of a blur. It's all a blur. But the point is, I definitely read it for school and I adore it. I have read it many, many times. There are references to it in Brightly Burning because I inserted a lot of bookish Easter eggs into the book. It is a fine piece of journalism. Because it is so immediate. It was such an extraordinary story, but also because Jon Krakauer does a pretty good job at examining himself as both journalist and participant and some of the conflicts of interest there. I read it in college. I read it again recently before the movie Everest came out. I've read all of Krakauer's other books and work. He is an excellent kind of in-depth life investigative journalist. I highly recommend anything by Jon Krakauer, but I adore Into Thin Air. And last but not least, I'm gonna cheat just a little bit. This wasn't assigned for class, but it was given to me by my German professor in college, and it is a weird little book and I adore it and I aspire to write something like it someday, and I wanna give a little shout out for something that's a bit more off the beaten track. It is called Simple Stories, and it is by a German author called Ingo Schulze. So I read this in translation. It is a series of short stories that are all about people from one town in the former East Germany. So it takes place in the 90s after German reunification. And at first you think they're just simple short stories, but as you read each successive story, you know, characters from one story appear in other stories, and you start to kind of get this sense that there's a bigger picture here. And ultimately it is a haunting portrait of life in the German Democratic Republic, the reality of reunification, and just kind of disillusionment with life and systems. And it's a gorgeous book, and I think I enjoyed it because, and it was recommended to me because it is personal to me. So I was a high school foreign exchange student. I lived in the former East Germany in the year 2000 to 2001. So that was 10 years after reunification. And I was just struck by how it wasn't what I thought it would be. I lived in this place that was communist for 40 years, that was, you know, Soviet controlled for 40 years, and the people weren't what I expected. It really broadened my horizons as an American, and I think Simple Stories is a really beautiful and rare book that explores, you know, the nuances of the German Democratic Republic and of the reunification of Germany, and both the pros and the cons of that. So it's a beautiful little book. It is, you know, it's a little bit obscure, but I highly, highly recommend it. So definitely life-changing for me in the sense that it really expanded my horizons in terms of literature, including literary novels, and it's definitely, maybe someday I'll attempt something as ambitious, but who knows. Alright, so that is it, because I am incapable of short answers. That's just a couple of the, you know, answers to the questions that you guys sent to me. look for part 2 really soon. I'm gonna answer the rest of your questions. So again, I'm going to do, more Q&A videos, drop more questions down below or on the original post, and I will add them to the list. I would love to make this an ongoing thing, an ongoing series of, direct engagement and Q&As, answering your questions about, ask me anything about my books, my writing process, the publishing industry, craft, I'm not the best at book recs, but I'll try. Anything goes. So drop any questions or comments down below. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, happy writing, everyone.